I'm waving my magic wand. I mean, when I leave here, the first thing I'm doing is I'm writing my submission to National Treasury on their taxation law amendment bill and getting component manufacturers recognized within the tax appreciation. That's a realistic one. Wild and wonderful ones would obviously be R&D specific incentives. I think more direct attention to component exports. I think the policy does quite a bit at the moment to try promote exports, but I think there's more that can be done and more that should be done to really, to some extent, stabilize the sector. I think if you have a bigger export basket, an export-led market, I think that's really good from whatever's happening domestically, we've got that stability.
You mentioned there's a gap of potentially 30 billion rand worth of sales that could be made.
We're really where the opportunity sits, right?
Yep.
We're 39.5% local content rate average per South African vehicle produced. We should be getting to 60% 2035. Our calculations mean we should be around 46% now. And the shortfall in where we are, where we should be, is about 30 billion rands worth of sales per annum. One of the revolutionary ones. And we put forward hydrogen economy and fuel cells.
Sorry. Thanks, Beth.
We're an industry association representing automotive component manufacturers. And traditionally, if you look around the world at what is an industry association, it's, I suppose, the easiest way to explain it, the middleman between the members, those being component manufacturers, and then your key stakeholders, typically your government.
Yeah.
And what are we there to do? We're there to create a coordinated policy stance. And policy in that sense effectively means instruments that the government can put in place that would support the growth and development of the sector.
Yeah.
I think automotive really in South African context is at the pinnacle of industrial policy. Our sector wouldn't be here, quite frankly, without the policies that we have, the investment incentives, production incentives. It's a whole cachet of I guess, different incentivization to effectively make the sector globally competitive.
Yeah, I think it's one of the few policies that has actually been around for long and actually has worked. What's it like being a woman in a very, very, very male-dominated industry?
My general experience has been I wouldn't be where I am without male allies, if I can call them that, who have supported me and mentored me. And there hasn't been many a woman in this kind of position. And so you have to look to the men. And I've been very fortunate to have a lot of really supportive mentors around me who have enabled me to see opportunities, enabled me to grow. And that's been great. I don't necessarily think that's the experience of every woman in the sector. And I think there's a lot of ground that we need to cover to kind of break the barriers. And more often than not, you're always going to come across a few naysayers and challenging individuals. But by and large, I've received incredible support and encouragement. I would encourage any other person or woman or man to come into the sector, into component manufacturing. There's a place for everyone.
Yeah, we need everyone that's passionate about this stuff to be involved. So you say you started out as a 1-month intern at NAACAM as a researcher, and now you're head of policy at NAACAM.
Yeah, head of policy and regulation.
How did that happen?
I think we've also recognized as NAACAM's grown a hell of a lot over the last probably 4 or 5 years in terms of moving away from what maybe a traditional industry association does to offering a much wider basket of services to our members. And so with that, obviously, projects have grown. The need for more people has grown. And I've been lucky enough to find myself in the right place at the right time and kind of progress with the growth of the company. And also, I think I've shown areas where we need to grow and how I could support that. And that's ultimately enabled me to go analyst, project manager for knowledge services, and then as of January this year, head of policy.
Well done.
Thank you.
It's awesome. That's a very quick progression. I think that what I often tell people is that if we just talk about the gender mark journey is that often people miss seeing the luck. So luck is always there.
Yeah.
But you have to be ready to see it and then take the gamble to take it.
Yeah.
Lots of people just watch the luck go past them.
Exactly.
And then they wonder why they're not lucky. So if there was somebody from the complete outside South Africa, outside the automotive industry, and you were to give them a high-level overview of the policy that we currently have adopted, how would you describe it to them, and why should they care about the policy, and how could it benefit them if they wanted to come to South Africa?
One thing we've become acutely aware of, and if you read media a lot at the moment, you're seeing a lot about OEM volume drops, and that's obviously a big problem for the component sector. And so the way we kind of thinking about it is there's only so much our market can take in terms of local production and in terms of also selling into the local market. The export market for component manufacturers where I think the real opportunities lie. And so how do we capitalize on that. At the moment, our export basket is very heavy towards catalytic converters and very Eurocentric. How do we preserve those, recognizing the importance of them, but equally, I don't know, share the love in a corny sense and expand it to other components that could be exported into other markets that we've never ever really considered before. And in fact, the Treasury has just released the amendment bill now for public commentary. That appears to currently just be applying to OEMs. We'll obviously put forward a case to suggest that it should be extended to component manufacturers. Ultimately, the more we're incentivizing and improving the cost competitiveness of the component sector, that's better for OEMs producing here because now their supply chain is more competitive. And it's also really good for the strength, sustainability of our sector in terms of to promote export. So we're currently in what we call APDP, or the Automotive Production Development Program Phase 2. And I mean, we wholeheartedly believe it's an excellent program. I think you and I were chatting the other day and saying, I mean, so many of the businesses in the sector simply wouldn't be here without it. It's really good in promoting exports. It's really good in promoting some level of local production. We as NAACAM, and this is when you say what is policy for us, this is maybe an area where we would look into it, is to say, how do we get it to do more in terms of driving localization? That's where your value add, your job creation sits. So there's always tweaks and bits and bobs that you can do to make it the most optimal policy framework for your sector. And that's what we as NAACAM do, and that's what policy means to us.
Okay. Maybe we could just stay a little bit on the sort of policy topic.
So it's quite a complex policy system that we have, but equally very simplistic in some senses. So it's built on duty rebates for both production, assembly, exports. Primarily your OEM, so your original equipment manufacturers, are heavily supported from the program, and they get duty credits for what they produce, and additionally what they're then exporting. And that basically, and the reason I start with the OEMs is that creates the business case for them to be here, right? They're getting significant incentivization. And then with an OEM being here, you have a supply chain that's developing behind it and supporting it. And so that's where, as a component manufacturer, if you're not direct exporting, and I'll touch on that side in a second, that's really where the duty rebate credit system supports you, as that is supporting your customer, and that enables you to be present in the country. If you're direct exporting, as you know, then it's slightly different. You do directly benefit from the core export incentives. And so that would obviously support component exports, and it's been very lucrative, particularly in the CACCON industry. And it's based on a whole bunch of different mechanisms to do with the value addition that takes place in the country. The OEMs now have something called VALA, which is Volume Assembly Localization Allowance, which is effectively to try and encourage them. The more you localize, the bigger your incentive. The balance might be slightly off, and that's something I think Renee was on your podcast a while ago, and I'm sure he would have said it then, that that's something that we would look at possibly tweaking so that we're having better promotion of localization. So that's the one part of it. And then AIS, I think from component manufacturing perspective, is key. So AIS is a cash grant. So if you were coming and investing in a new project, new machinery, new building for a new project, you can get, as a component manufacturer, currently 25% cash grant back from the government for your of a qualifying investment. And I'm sure we'll get into a wider EV conversation, but very recently they've now announced if you're producing any EV-specific or new energy-specific components, you will be getting a 35% cash grant back from the government for your qualifying investment, which is a huge amount of money if you're thinking of the size of investments that component manufacturers are making.
Okay. And is that only applicable to component manufacturers or also the OEM?
So OEMs are at 20% for both internal combustion engine and NEV components. So they sat at the 20% mark.
Okay.
Separately at the moment, there's still, I mean, look, our EV white paper was released, I think, December last year or maybe November. And so there's still a lot of operationalization to kind of take place. Nevertheless, so AIS has come through, and then there is a tax depreciation allowance for OEMs.
Is there intention of APDP or any of, let's just talk about policy in general. Is it there to stimulate an industry as it has done in the automotive world, and then eventually move away? It's now gotten to a size where it can sustain itself? Or is it something there forever?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I think if you look around the world, you see that you can have variations of it, but realistically speaking, any big industry around the world, you see that has some degree of policy, and with that some degree of protection. I think the kind of free world, as we maybe have learned in the history books, and no trade barriers, etc. And then policy also incorporates that, the duties you put on things, trade barriers, etc. everyone is in a kind of very protectionist stage, I guess, at the moment.
Yeah.
My own sense is you will always need some degree of policy and some degree of incentivization specifically. I mean, policy always.
Yeah.
Incentivization, one would hope you grow your sector to a point where it doesn't require such large inputs.
Where it doesn't cost the taxpayer.
Look, I think there always will be some degree of cost, but I think what you're getting back from the sector, and I think that's what we always try to amplify is, yes, there's a cost associated with supporting our sector, but what we're giving back in terms of, if you were removing the automotive sector, I think you'd find general industrial capacity in South Africa would completely disappear. And with that, there's a load of jobs attached to that. There's a load of ancillary jobs attached to it, service providers, etc., that would go. Economic growth. I mean, we alone as the automotive sector, I think it's about 5%, 5.4% contribution to GDP. And then attach that 21% of manufacturing output. That's not something where in the South African context, I think we can just say, let's get rid of it. I think we are a country that requires a degree of industrial base. And I do think automotive is, as I said at the start, kind of the pinnacle of that. And the knock-on effects would be devastating from an economic growth and development type of perspective. So I don't think we'll get to a point where it's going to cost the taxpayer absolutely nothing, but equally what the taxpayer gets. And I still think currently what you get from it is far more than what, as a taxpayer, you're paying for it. So I don't think you'll ever find a point where there's zero incentivization. I mean, you actually can see it even in Europe at the moment. They're pulling back on all of the more demand side incentives, and you can see the impact that's having on the market and then subsequently manufacturers. So even that advanced economy, you see that kind of dependence to some extent.
I think there's which kind of leads into the whole EV thing, right? I think they've artificially propped up the demand for EV by creating incentives to the consumer directly, which is, I think, very different to APDP. APDP is providing incentive to manufacture.
Precisely.
Not the consumer. So if you can manufacture more cost effectively, consumers want your product. But I think they've artificially propped up the EV industry to create demand, in the hope that they would get to an economies of scale where they wouldn't need the cost of the vehicles would be cheaper and wouldn't require the incentive to the consumer. And that hasn't worked. I think you can't falsely create a market.
No.
At the end, the market will decide.
But I do actually think, I mean, if you were to say, and at least from the CACCOM perspective, I think the area we're starting to look into is the hydrogen space. I mean, the risk we have is, depending how fast the EV transition happens, if it goes all the way or we stop at some point. But CACCONs obviously don't have a place in a battery electric vehicle. But a lot of the CACCON companies are multinational, and their head offices are doing a lot in the more hydrogen fuel cell type of arena, and we obviously in a good position to capitalize on that.
For the same reasons.
For the exact same reason. And so it's about getting the right policies in place now. And that's when I speak about operationalizing the white paper. This is exactly what we mean. How do we get the right policy to speak to a specific subsector to become the next best in the world for doing it? What we spend a lot of time at NAACAM doing is trying to think, well, what is another CACCON type sector? Where is another area where we can sit down and say, as South Africa, we are the best in the world to be producing it. Let's produce here, export to the world, and kind of make it a bedrock of our component basket. Don't have the answers entirely yet.
What is it about CATCON that made it so stand out?
So this is really a success story of minerals, right? So we have PGM minerals in South Africa, and it's one of the few minerals that I guess, or raw material, shall we go? I get minerals, raw materials. There's nuances to it, but it's really a success story of local beneficiation, developing the right policy at the right time. I mean, at one point in time, I think we were, don't quote me on the number, but around 80% of global CACCON production was taking place in South Africa. You certainly benefited from that CACCON industry. And that really is by virtue of having PGMs and then having a very supportive policy framework that recognized the value of PGMs and the opportunity that could create.
So we have an interesting view into the current state of automotive manufacturing globally. Because we have a lot of catalytic converter machines around the world running literally almost, I think, except Australia, every continent, there's some machines of Gendermark building CATCONs.
So why isn't this more than, that's the kind of story that you need to be building, or as a South African industry, we need to really be amplifying?
Yeah, I think we've got a pretty big market share. Probably it's hard to calculate machine
Yeah.
market share, but I think we're certainly up there. And what's interesting is over the last couple of years, I'd say 2 years, we've watched a massive drop off in volumes in these plants.
Okay.
So we have some of the biggest plants that are gender mark plants running
Yeah.
our machines. So we have an insight into what's going on in all of these different factories, or a lot of the tier ones, for example, and some OEMs have our machines. And we saw a big drop off 2 years ago from the point where we were making 10 catalytic converter lines a year to literally 2 and then 0 a year, right?
Sure.
So there's a big
Yeah.
disruption for us. We thought it would be a gradual thing over time, but it was like kind of off a cliff. And then over the last 6 to 8 months, it's just gone up like this, like literally up a mountain, both on customers wanting new machines, which is interesting. And the reason why they want new machines, and we can see this from our plants around the world, they're all at capacity.
Yeah.
So that we spent 18 months moving machines around, refurbishing, putting them into different plants, like literally relocating machines from one part of the world to the other part of the world, because people didn't want to spend more on capital.
Yeah.
Typically, they'll throw those things away and start again, where there was a new program. So, but now almost every single plant that we have machines in is at capacity, building CATCONs, including Germany.
Yeah.
So something's changing.
And it was dropping off. I mean, we saw it. I mean, we hit top CATCON exports, or top sector exports, which was driven by CATCONs, in I think 21 or 22 thereabouts. And last year we had the dip, and that was entirely driven by a drop in the sales of CATCONs. But you're right, when you speak to our members now,
yeah,
they're always keen for more business, and there's always more they want to do to bolster themselves. And for us, it's how do we pull as much CATCON volume to South Africa as possible. But you're absolutely right in the kind of trend you're picking up on.
So it's interesting. And we look at we also have an insight into which OEMs, right? Because we make the machines that, and the tooling for specific OEMs. And it's interesting. Obviously, I can't give you too much detail around that, but it's what you hear in the market and what media says about what's going to happen. It's not actually what's happening on the ground at the moment. The fund the OEMs created,
the AITF, the Auto Industry Transformation Fund.
I think that would be much better spent on R&D. Because you'll
controversial.
I honestly think so. I think the short-term benefit is better. There's no question about that. But the long-term sustainability of an industry is not going to come from assembling components.
No, so I mean, I think they're trying to solve two different problems in that sense. So I think AITF, we're very I don't want to say pro, but we're very, for us, it's the first time that you're seeing actual almost mandated A, transformation, and B, localization. I think that's where AITF is fundamental in that. I mean, our master plan talks about developing tier 2 black-owned industrialists, I think 25% value add coming from them. That's just talk, right? That's just objectives. AITF mandates that you're putting in your money, you are now funding black-owned industrialists, you're giving them guaranteed market access, guaranteed almost scalability in that sense, because there's an actual contract coming with it. They're not having, we spoke about component manufacturing being somewhat high risk in the sense of it's a lot of front-end investment without even necessarily having a guaranteed market contract. And AITF somewhat resolves that for a critical element or part of our sector. And so I think AITF, in terms of solving for transformation particularly, and then over the longer-term localization, that's fundamental. But I think you're onto an interesting point if we say there's scope to have another kind, or maybe it's add on to AITF, which looks at R&D as well. And can we create a fund where we're putting in the capital required for it, but equally, I think the thing is we're putting in that kind of guaranteed OEM working with the sector to drive R&D, because I think that's where AITF has seen the best success, is that your OEMs are bought into the idea, the component manufacturers are bought into the idea, and they're working together collectively because OEMs benefiting, they're fulfilling their market access requirements, component manufacturer benefiting, they've got guaranteed market contracts. That kind of model could theoretically be transposed onto an R&D type of discussion with its own nuances, but it's an interesting thought.
I've been kind of reading up on it. So you look at South Korea over the last 25 years, Samsung, Hyundai, Kia, and the list goes on. And they incentivized R&D and created these really powerful brands and turned the country around over the last 50 years, completely. And I think they spend like 5% of their GDP on R&D. And a lot of the, obviously, is driven by or spent through policy, right? And that makes sense for that scenario. On the other hand, if you look at Mexico, only spend 0.5% on R&D. But they have a big advantage because they have a big customer just above them.
Yeah, location.
We don't have that. So we can't adopt an assembly mindset.
No.
It just won't work. So we have to adopt an R&D mindset. And we've got the skills. We've got the evidence of Prattley Putty and the Optimal Energy Jewel and the Roy Falk helicopter and the Creepy Crawley, the Dulles. I actually Googled it. I can't find the page now, but there's a long list of amazing South African, the CAT scan.
Yeah.
As an example, the first heart transplant.
Exactly.
The list goes on of that R&D innovation technology, but policy doesn't talk to it.
Yeah.
And if you ever speak to the minister, if you ever want to bring him around, please do so. And I think that's how we will create the jobs. It's a long-term approach.
Yeah.
It's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. But if you create that policy, VW used to R&D. The City Golf was a South African car. They created a completely new cockpit, new gearbox, new engine. Although the outside stayed the same, they changed the safety ratings of that vehicle over the years. Eventually, it got to a point where they couldn't. But they R&D'd that car for 20 years, and it's purely a South African car.
One of the stories I always say is we speak to some of our members and we say, well, who's your biggest competitor in Africa? And they say, no, it's ourselves. But it's not. It's fake imports that are being imported. You stick a label on it that's our member, and that's what it's being sold at. So it's the counterfeits as well that there's a challenge with. So you've got grey imports, you've got cheap imports, counterfeits, etc. So I think those kind of challenges need to be tackled, and I know that they are tackling it. There's quite a few countries that are starting to implement policies, and it's not an overnight thing. They're not banning grey imports today. Consumers wouldn't be too impressed with that, unfortunately, but they are phasing it out. So I know some countries have put age limits on what the grey import can be. There's a big push to kind of have safety standards apply. So if it's, for example, if the vehicle is coming from the States, if it's not roadworthy in the States, it's not roadworthy in Africa, don't send it this way.
Yeah.
And that starts to kind of filter out the market and then create a market base where we can be selling South African assembled and South African produced vehicles into an African market.
Yeah.
And that would certainly grow volumes. And you can see it with a lot of the OEMs here, what their strategy is ultimately Africa. And if we can get that right, that will grow their volumes, that will grow the component sector volumes. And then those R&D conversations also become easier because you've already got scalability on maybe this particular model that's being sold on the continent. There's scalability in R&D for that,
Talk to us about the white paper that was released in December. So anyone that's interested, any of the NAACAM members or anyone, again, from the outside, what is the intention behind that? And when do you think we'll actually see something material?
Yes, I think there are already some material things, but I'll get to that in a second. I think effectively there was a big need from the sector to kind of understand, well, what are we as a sector going to do together, both private sector players and then the government, in terms of progressing our NEV transition. It's a recognition that the world is moving and we need to move with the world.
Yeah.
Otherwise we're risking being left behind. And so the NEV white paper came out November, December. Took quite some time to get there, which to some extent we need to be quick with policy decisions and we need to be quick with policy implementation. At the same time, what I can say is it was a very consultative process. So, I mean, we had multiple meetings with the then Minister of DTIC, Minister or the Finance Minister. So it was a long, drawn-out process of trying to figure out what is the right balance of policy measures. And I think we can't ignore the fact that we are sitting within a financially constrained economy.
Yeah.
There's not a huge amount of money to throw at the problem. And there's arguably certain, I guess, more, we're also in an election period, which has to be taken into consideration when thinking about what money's being put on the table. And there's other big items that also need to be, it's not just the automotive sector. I can't sit in a
the
bubble.
Basics, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I can't just think that, auto sector is the sole thing that the government must worry about. Nevertheless, I think the decision that was taken and what you'll see in the white paper is effectively the white paper talks about two phases, and it's your production-led phase, which is currently, and then I think it talks from 2028 onwards, the more demand market side of the policy implementation or the policy plan. I think it's more so a plan at this stage, to be fair. Why have we done that, or why did the government decide on that? We're exporting about 60% of the vehicles we produce. I think from a component side, probably about 30% of the components in terms of value that we're producing are being exported. So this is talking separately. So if we look at proportionality of our sales, about 2/3 goes to local OEMs, 1/3 goes to export market. Obviously varies by company, but we are primarily, as a component sector, here to support and here to produce for the local OEMs, rather than for the export market. The CAPCON is the kind of unique jewel in the crown, if we can call it that. So we were kind of in recognition that, well, even beyond what we're direct exporting, obviously indirect component exports, if we're exporting 60% of our vehicles, 60% of the components going towards the OEMs are being indirectly exported. And the concern is that that's then also primarily going to Europe. About 60-70% are going Europe, UK, and they obviously have quite tight timelines in terms of removing sales of new carbon-emitting vehicles from, I think, 2035-ish. And so the recognition was probably the export market needed to change more rapidly, or the exported products need to change more rapidly than what we're selling locally. I don't think South Africa's market is going to move that fast. So that's why it became a production-led strategy, which was to say, the South African market isn't really there for that level of EV adoption yet, but our export products need to move very quickly. And that's why it became production-led. And so if you were looking in the white paper, what NAACAM as an association has tried to do is really put component manufacturing at the center of any policy focus. We always will argue that it's component manufacturing where you see majority of the jobs. We'd have about 83,000 to the OEMs, 30 or so thousand. So we are about 83, and to be fair to the OEMs, about 33,000 or somewhere there. From a CapEx perspective, yes, we invest less than them. So I think they are higher in that regard. But if you're thinking about what we're at the employment size, nevertheless sizable CapEx investments, sizable component exports, we're a critical sector, and I think we're really where the opportunity sits, right? We're on a 39.5% local content rate average per South African vehicle produced. We should be getting to 60% 2035. Our calculations mean we should be around 46% now, and the shortfall in where we are, where we should be, is about 30 billion rands worth of sales per annum, which you could argue a lot, not a lot. That's still a lot of lost potential, and we have absolutely every ability to do it. I don't think it's a manufacturing capability conversation. It's just about maybe tweaking policy measures and getting people on board with that kind of localization strategy, not underplaying the global dynamics that make it hard, but more needs to be done in that space. And that's where we wanted to say within the NEV transition and in the white paper, please prioritize that. We can't risk going back from the 39.5%, and we certainly need to do more to progress up in that, and that's where you'll find your economic benefit. So if you were now, long story short, to look at the white paper, after a lot of meetings from NAACAM's side, I mean, a very deliberate media campaign, very deliberate research activities that look specifically into localization potential and what can be done there. I think big success for the component sector. And the white paper talks to investment incentives, R&D incentives for OEMs and for component manufacturers. It also talks to the one thing that we were positioning really strongly is, when I said earlier that our sector is quite technology agnostic, it's great to focus on how do we incentivize NEV production, but we also need to look at general competitiveness improvements, right? You know, if we can make everything more competitive, that's great for whatever technology we're producing. And so that's where you also see within the white paper a strong focus on infrastructure reforms, energy reforms. A north-south corridor has been mentioned within the white paper, which I think would be excellent, particularly for Nelson Mandela Bay, where we are now. So I think it's quite well focused. The other thing we really like from it is I remember very clearly when we were having a meeting with senior DTIC officials, and they said, well, what are your kind of normal policy requests, and then what are the revolutionary ones? And we put forward hydrogen economy and fuel cells as a more revolutionary in the sense of it's not at the same stage as a battery electric kind of ecosystem currently, but we see the potential there. So we put that forward as, if you want revolutionary, here you go. And that's come forward. So it talks not just about developing a battery value chain, but also about the hydrogen economy and fuel cell production.
I think there's a distinct difference between battery electric and hydrogen electric. Very, very different. Obviously, battery electric is quite a bit ahead of hydrogen.
For sure.
But hydrogen is definitely gaining some momentum. I think there's which kind of leads into the whole EV thing, right? Germany, South Korea, and the US, especially on the tech side, China, from an EV perspective, they develop the tech, and then they build manufacturing on top of that. You can't just do the assembly, because then you're always going to be under pressure price-wise, and somebody's always going to be able to do it cheaper, right? So I'm to be honest with you, not completely convinced about EV. I think that there is a space. It makes sense. Hybrid makes even more sense.
I don't think we're going to see what we see now or what we saw maybe 10, 20 years ago with internal combustion engines, where that was it. I think you're going to see a market that's very divided in some sense. And as you say, it has a mix of battery electric, fuel cell, particularly in a more kind of commercial vehicle situation. Internal combustion engine for some markets still, I think, will be predominant technology for the years to come.
Yeah.
And I think you're seeing that in the OEMs and the way that they're now producing cars. And there's a few brands that have, this is my EV particular line, but a lot of them will have a singular model, and there'll be the ICE equivalent, there'll be the BEV version, there'll be the hybrid version. And I think that's what makes sense for the OEM. And that's also probably what makes sense for the consumers, having that choice of vehicle.
Yeah. I think VW have changed their position. They're now going to keep an internal combustion engine, which is good for a factory here in PE.
Exactly. And I mean, that's, for our sector, it's also interesting from a component perspective, because what we always say is our export basket is heavily ICE driven because of the catalytic converters. And I think the next biggest exported item is our engine parts. So it's very ICE. But outside of that, I mean, our sector is quite agnostic, or technology agnostic, as we call it, in the sense of, the example I'll always give is a seat is a seat is a seat.
Yeah.
I don't care what you're producing, as long as you're producing larger volumes of it so I can make a good business case out of it.
Doesn't matter.
We'll supply it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I could give you my 2 cents on, if you ever speak to, I know you just came from a meeting with the Deputy Minister
indeed,
of Trade and Industry and Competition. If you ever get to speak to them again, and if you agree with me or not, but I think what's missing in our policy, and I take the I guess lessons we could learn from a country like South Korea, is R&D.
Yeah.
So I think what we've become, and why I think we're playing a price game in the tier 1 space, is because all we do is assembly.
Yeah.
The majority of the manufacturing side has deteriorated, and we're becoming an assembly place.
Precisely.
And if you assemble, it just comes down to labor cost. And so it's a direct labor cost, or the cost of labor directly impacts your profitability. And that's not a good place to be, because then you're just having to pay less and less to workers, which is counterproductive. Whereas I think if you take a longer term approach and incentivize R&D. So I'll give you a hypothetical example. So VW is going to announce that they're going to be producing a new vehicle in the plant here.
Yeah.
I don't know what the vehicle is, but there's components that are going to go into that vehicle. And take a South African organization, Lumotech, that make lights, headlights and whatever. I think that there should be some sort of incentive, as opposed to some of the other ones that we have, that would incentivize VW to work with a local, either South African or multinational, to R&D the light in South Africa.
Correct, yeah.
Because if you build up that skill base, the R&D of lights, which goes into every kind of vehicle, is then localized. And then the manufacturing side of things becomes a byproduct of the R&D. Whereas at the moment, a company like Lumotech, I would imagine, I don't know them at all, I'm just thinking of them because they're down the road here, have to partner with a technology partner from overseas, and they're beholden to them. Whereas if VW worked with Lumotech or anyone else directly to R&D the product, Lumotech would learn the skills to R&D lights for anyone else. And then they could be a global source of light manufacturing, just as a simple example. But I think it does require an incentive to both OEM and tier 1 together. And at the moment, I don't think policy kind of talks to that.
Yeah.
Because all policy is doing is pushing localization, and the easiest thing to localize is assembly, and then you import all the components. So
exactly. And I mean, that's where we talk about the deeper value addition, and there's part of that which is doing more of the value added parts here. But R&D is certainly, I think, as a country, we don't have a huge R&D sector. I was in Tunisia with AAAM, the African Association there. And we went to a component manufacturer there who I think came into operation somewhere around 1990 or thereabouts. So it's relatively new in the grand scheme of things. But I mean, they have the most incredible R&D facilities, a Tunisian company, which is now, I think, 18 or so locations worldwide, 2 R&D centers, I think 1 Mexico and 1 in Tunisia.
Wow.
No, it's not Tunisia, it's somewhere else. But developed off the back of R&D, developed such a core competency. And now, I mean, they've got something like 20, I don't actually know exactly. It was somewhere around that proportion of market share. And incredible.
Yeah, that's
incredible.
amazing.
And it's on the back of R&D. And this is a Tunisian company. And I mean, first of all, Tunisia's automotive component sector wowed me in the sense I didn't even realize that there was such an established sector. But I mean, it goes to show what can be done once you have that R&D capability and the partnership with OEMs.
We've got a team in Tunisia now installing a machine.
Really?
Yeah. Pretty cool machine as well.
No, it's an advanced sector.
Yeah, for sure. And Morocco as well. And isn't Morocco making more cars than us now or something?
Not yet.
Not yet. Close.
Not yet. It is close. It is
Yeah.
close. I mean, and this is where South Africa's in the tricky position in the sense of, I mean, North Africa, it's the proximity to Europe that's effectively driving it. So, I mean, Tunisia,
it's the Mexico story, right?
So Tunisia doesn't have a singular OEM.
Yep.
But they're a 2-hour flight from France, which makes their lives 100% easier than ours in the sense of it's that proximity to the customer. And so it goes back to what you were saying, you know, R&D is cheaper here than elsewhere. If you're a European OEM, it makes sense to a large extent.
What's your unique selling point?
Yeah, exactly. And so South Africa, we can't have that selling point, right? We're on the southern tip of Africa. There's advantages. We're between shipping routes, the coast, etc. But we need to find where else we have. And there is a core reason, right? There wouldn't be a sector without there being some degree of logic for us being here. Yeah. But it's how do we even grow on that, and how do we become a bigger player? And I think unlocking, I suppose, the African market also offers a big opportunity in that. If we can get that right and unlock, I know AAAM always talks about a large growing kind of proportion of the population in the continent that could be purchasing vehicles. If we can get that right, that opens a whole new kind of pool of opportunities of volume, etc. Imagine if we started R&D 50 years ago. You know, if we don't do it now, we'll be sitting here in 50 years saying, imagine if we tried to unlock the African market 50 years ago. So you have to be doing as much as you can now, recognizing some things will be quick, some things will be longer term. But you've got to be doing it. And ultimately, if we're tying it all up into the policy kind of conversation, that's where you need to have really smart policy and policy that is strategic and flexible and quick, that can identify opportunities, but also weave them all together. So you're creating a kind of a coherent ecosystem that all is pushing the sector in the same direction rather than pulling in different directions. Yeah,
makes sense. You mentioned there's a gap of potentially 30 billion rand worth of sales that could be made. If you were to pick a component or 2 or 3, I'm putting you on the spot here, that could fill the gap, that you think is the low-hanging fruit to localize, do you have any idea of what that might be?
I've been taught hard lessons, which is there are no low-hanging fruits in localization. And so nothing is ever easy in that regard. Nothing is easy. There's easier places to start. But I sometimes think that's not what's going to move the needle. It moves the needle, and we should be always trying to do that. But I don't think it's going to be the one easy thing to do is where we've already localized, and we've localized it for one OEM. Why is another OEM not also locally sourcing that product? So that's the light. That's the easy one, right? Okay. If we're going to go revolutionary, and I go back to the NEV transition, and this will have application, I think, for exports, and I think it's an exciting opportunity, is we have 6 key commodities that we did identify that I think are the big opportunities for me. And it won't necessarily improve the local content in South African vehicles if we aren't producing NEVs, but it's still growing our component sector. So for me, I think where do I see big opportunities? I think thermal management systems. We have we have a few good companies in that space with access to this kind of R&D, not necessarily doing it locally, but they have access to it. And I think that's a big opportunity. Wiring harnesses. And then batteries, if we're going the full BEV route, there's a lot of talk about developing a battery value chain. And whilst I think cell manufacturing is currently quite a challenging thing to have on the continent, shall we call it, I think there's
costs a lot.
It costs a lot. But if we're talking about low-hanging fruit, if we're going to be going the battery route, why are we not assembling batteries locally, producing the enclosures, the modules, the management systems? Those are low-hanging fruit in a completely battery kind of center conversation. And the irony is we have companies already producing it that are exporting it to big EV brands. We can be doing it locally if we were to be producing EVs. So for me, those would be the kind of low-hanging fruit, I guess. And then also some of the more revolutionary things. I think fuel cells is where I see a lot of interesting opportunities. And we have a couple of companies. I know you are doing assembly lines for I think you were saying for the tanks, if I'm not mistaken. We have a member that's looking into the membrane electrode assembly production in South Africa. So
that's
I think
key. That's where the money sits, right?
MES. So I think that's a really interesting opportunity. And I think I wouldn't at all call that an easy localization opportunity, but
that's R&D.
That's R&D, and I think that's really exciting.
There you go. I'm glad you're excited about an R&D thing.
I thought that I'm not excited about R&D.
Because no, I'm just kidding. But but that's an example of, if they get it right, that's going to be sustainable forever. Huge. Not forever, but for a long time.
Yeah,
and you can build on that,
as the pinnacle of doing that kind of stuff. So I mean, their operations they're starting it up now. I think they've just launched their factory, and it's a really exciting exciting project and a project that is NAACAM we're wanting to support as extensively as possible. Because I think what we've learned in this whole thing is we don't necessarily want to pick the winner of the race. I think that there's almost 20 different races happening, and there's a space for all of them. And so whatever we can support, we will support to both ensure that we're in a position to capitalize on any opportunity, but also mitigate as many risks as possible. So for me, not at all the easy low-hanging fruit, but I think probably the most exciting one currently is that fuel cell conversation.
That's awesome.
And it's also great for the CapCon guys if that works out.
Yeah, for sure. I think the nuance in my passion or push for R&D is that it has to be linked to the OEM.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to go back to the light example. R&Ding a headlight for a car without the OEM is futile.
No, so
if you take why India is able to transition so quickly to EVs, because they have the OEMs in India. The Tatas, the Mahindras, the Ashok Leylands are transitioning, and the scooter manufacturers are all transitioning to EV because the OEMs are there and tier one is benefiting from that. We don't have the benefit of South African OEMs. So how do you incentivize the OEMs that are here to develop that locally, that skill based locally?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why I say I think some incentive plus policy to get an OEM to say, make a link arm for your axle with a local tier one, and I'll give you money for that.
Yeah.
So that link arm manufacturing becomes a thing for South Africa through that tier one, and then you can export the link arm to other people. But you got to have the OEM involved.
You have to have the OEM involved, and I think you also have to have the scalability attached to that. I think on current South African volumes alone, it's hard to do the R&D. So you need to be doing it at exactly with the OEM partner, but for a wider market.
GM, when they were here, used to export cats.
Yeah.
They never made them, but they worked with tier ones to make them, obviously because of the APDP benefit. But that's an example of a policy that enabled GM to actually make money in South Africa.
Well, that's, the same way. Most of your OEMs, you'll see it, that they effectively, the cat guys some of them are direct exporting, but a lot of it is also going via your OEMs, which is they're not making it, but they are selling it to their sister companies around the world. And that's where I was saying earlier, what's our next cat? And I think that also somewhat talks to where we're going to develop the R&D, where we're going to develop the core competency and say, this is South Africa's, I guess, finest component operations. This is where we're most competitive, and we believe we have the best technology and capability, and we become that global supply. Long-ish horizon. That's not going to be a short-term.
No, it's a long-term thing.
Project. That is a long-term thing, but I think it's something that we do need to, and we are looking into how do we get ourselves into that position where we can be having more R&D conversations rather than solely assembly conversations.
And I think there's global demand for it. So it's not like I don't think it needs to be propped up too much financially because there's demand for it. So it's too expensive to R&D in the US. It's too expensive to R&D in South Korea now, in Europe. And so they're moving to India, right? India is benefiting the most out of it.
For sure.
But I think we should be grabbing our piece.
And I think it's one of those things where, once you've had the first person who's tried and tested and proved it can work, that's when you'll start to see it.
It encourages that first mover.
You need innovative policy, and I think you also need innovative individuals and companies who are willing to take, policy can only do so much. You also need the companies to take that chance and see that bigger picture. I think sometimes the sector particularly has had so many issues recently. You're often very focused on the now, right?
Yeah, of course.
So you need to just keep the doors open, that there's a bigger picture. You need one or two people to buy into that bigger picture with the right policy, and that's when you'll see the change.
So if you could wave your magic wand and get the minister to listen to you and agree to whatever you ask for your members, what would that be?
It's literally kind of exactly what the meeting was this morning, which was a list of our opportunities, priorities, and how do we do it. I think for us, and R&D is a separate section to it, but all things being equal in our current situation where we are now, by and far the biggest thing is, or two biggest things, volume and localization. And with that, I'd couple in exports, because I think exports is where we'll derive most of our volume, particularly for components. But localization would be my biggest thing. That creates the opportunities for the sector to grow. That also creates the skill, it creates the capability, it expands on it, which will have knock-on effects. And I think you can put R&D in that same localization basket, right? It's the same topic, which is drive value addition and drive it at a component level. As we say, we can't just be an assembly destination. We need to be driving value. And that's, so if I'm waving my magic wand, I mean, when I leave here, the first thing I'm doing is I'm writing my submission to National Treasury on their taxation law amendment bill and getting component manufacturers recognized within the tax appreciation. That's a realistic one, I suppose. The more kind of wild and wonderful ones would obviously be R&D specific incentives. I think more direct attention to component exports. I think the policy does quite a bit at the moment to try promote exports, but I think there's more that can be done and more that should be done to really, I think, to some extent, stabilize the sector. I think if you have a bigger export basket, an export-led market, I think that's really good from whatever's happening domestically, we've got that stability. So that would be my big two things. I think other things, there's a lot that we'd love to do. I think for me, if there's one thing that doesn't necessarily talk to growing production or production per se, but if there's one thing that I know sits close to my heart, and I think also the NAACAM team, is not per se a magic wand for policy, but a magic wand maybe on people's minds, which is skilled individuals coming into the component sector at much larger numbers than what they currently are. I think when a grad is leaving and you ask at the start, how did I end up in the sector? And it wasn't a deliberate choice, it was an accident. And if there's one thing that I wish I could do and kind of, I don't know, open people's eyes with my magic wand and make them understand the opportunities in the sector, it would be that, which is grads recognizing that there is a place for them in the sector.
The coolness factor, right?
Exactly. And I think that for me, it's not policy, but it will talk to the competitiveness of the sector. It will talk to building a sustainable pipeline of skilled individuals. It's really more I suppose it's the marketing of the sector to some extent. If I could wave the magic wand and people were like, aha, component manufacturing. And to a large extent, we don't have a magic wand at NAACAM, unfortunately, but we do try and create as close to a magic wand as possible to get people to see what the sector is, what it's capable of, and why you want to be in it, and why it is something that, as taxpayers, as you say, why it's such an important sector to be supporting.
Well, we should promote this podcast so people can hear it.
Exactly.
I remember the question I wanted to ask you earlier.